There's a bit of a chill in the air, and that means it's sweater time. Upcycled sweater time, that is. I'm Jan Howell, and I love making things from upcycled sweaters of all kinds. And in this sewing tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make a pair of fingerless gloves from an upcycled sweater. Let's get started. First off, let's just go over some items and things that you'll need. Of course, you're going to need your upcycled sweater. We'll go over the tips and guidelines in choosing your sweaters in just a minute. You'll also need some straight pins, fabric scissors. I really like these sewing clips. They do come in handy. And if you're using a sweater that will fray, that has cotton in it or that's not felted and is going to fray, you'll need a strip of fleece. Let's just quickly go over some of the details and tips for choosing a sweater for your project. I do have a complete course and video tutorial that covers all the details of sweater upcycling that you might want to check out. But for this particular project, you want to choose a sweater that has some stretch to it. This sweater has been felted and would be great for a pair of mittens, which I also have a tutorial for and a pattern for, a full coverage mitten. It does not have a lot of stretch to it. It's been felted, it is warm, but it doesn't have a stretch to it. And that will not work for a pair of fingerless mittens because they need to be a little bit more stretchy and fitted towards your hand. This one is a wool sweater. It has been felted, but it has stretch to it. And it's a little thinner, which means it'll be a little bit more appropriate for a fingerless mitten and not so bulky. Another tip while we're on this piece of fabric is you want to make sure that whatever sweater you're using, that it is free of holes, or you can cut around the holes. So you can see that this sweater has a pretty good size hole here and one there, and you'll want to cut around that. It's really discouraging to make up a pair of mittens or something and find that it has a hole in it. So be careful and watch that before you cut out. Sleeves work really well because they have a cuff on them. And as you can see on this pair of mittens, I've used the cuff, the bottom cuff of a sweater. If you don't use a bottom cuff, you still can add a fleece cuff or binding. There's a pattern piece for the top and the bottom of the mitten binding. Cashmere sweaters work really nice. They're really cozy and soft. This particular cashmere sweater, I've already used the bottom cuff, but that I can still get a piece of white fleece and bind the top of that because it looks like it is going to fray. So a way that you can tell whether you need to bind the top or not after you've felted your sweater, or if the sweater does have some cotton in the sweater, you're most likely going to need to bind it. So this sweater has some cotton in it. You can see how it's starting to unravel, and you would want to bind that. And this one as well. You can see that it's binding, where this one on the cut, you can just kind of pull the edges and it's not unraveling. It will stay just fine, and it adds less bulk if you don't have to bind it, but the other sweaters will work just fine. I'm going to show you how to use a sleeve and also the bottom cuff of a sweater. So let's just start with the bottom cuff sweater. The pattern has you cut this side out on the fold. So fold over your fabric or the sweater. If you have lines, you want to make sure that those lines are lined up. And I'm going to make sure that I have enough to cut out 2. So take your pattern piece, align the bottom of the mitten where it's indicated on the bottom of the cuff and alongside the fold. And I'm just going to clip that in place. Or you can pin it. Cut that out. Then I'll cut the other side. So I have 2 pieces, and before I do anything, this particular fabric I need to bind because it is going to unravel. So I'll set those aside and show you how to cut the glove out from a sleeve. So turn it wrong side out and flatten it off so the seam is on the bottom. And I'll place the bottom of the glove down onto the edge of the cuff and pin it in place or clip it in place. So you may be wondering, well, there's not enough fabric here. Now this is what I want to show you, is that you can still use it if it's just this much smaller than the pattern, no problem, because it's a stretchy fabric. It's really a stretchy fabric, and it'll just be nice and cozy around your hand. So what I'm going to do is just pull that out. Just see, there's plenty down here at the bottom. I'm just going to make sure that that's snug and pin it in place. And then when I come over here to the thumb side, where the thumb is, the thumb hole, I'm just going to put another clip here. I'm going to gently pull the sleeve out. And I'm not, if it's just this small, that's fine. If it's way smaller, then it's probably not going to work. You'll have to either go up higher on the sleeve and add a bottom cuff, or find another piece that's big enough. This would definitely work for all these other smaller sizes. And this is the this is the large size. So I'm just gently going to pull that out to the side just a little bit, enough to give me enough to cut right there. And as you'll see, it will be just fine. So I'll pin that in place, and so I'll just cut it out. Going to hold that while I cut that line. And so that will be just fine and work really well. Now let me show you on this particular sleeve. So on this pink sleeve, let me just show you how that works out. It's significantly smaller, and there's not quite enough. So this probably wouldn't work for this size, but it would for a smaller size. Another thing you can do is just stick your arm in, find out where you would like that to be cut off, mark it with a pin and cut it off, and then cut a little hole where the thumb would go out. So about right there, and undo this seam right here, bind the top, and then you can just keep that seam, and it would work for a larger size. But it's not going to work with the pattern as it is. Does that make sense? So you can still use this in a couple different ways, either a smaller size or just unpicking that seam where the thumb hole would be. So the thing about sweaters is they all have their own character, just like humans and people. Each sweater is going to be different. So just use your judgment on when you're picking a sweater out. If it feels like it would be a good match for a mitten or a fingerless mitten around your hand and it's stretchy enough, you can work that. So one more note about the binding strip is if you are going to bind the bottom of the sweater, perhaps pretend this didn't have a cuff, you would cut a binding strip full length for the top and cut it at this length for the bottom cuff. And then apply it, and I'll show you how to apply that in just a second here. So let's go over how to bind the top and the bottom of the glove. I have cut out 2 of the strips, and I'm going to place the fleece right side down on top of with the right side facing up of the glove to the top. As you can see, it is smaller than the glove piece itself, and that's how you want it. It's okay. We want it smaller so that it will give it some snug fit at the top and some stretch. So you can pin that in place if you want to, or you can just hold it while you're sewing, which is what I will do. So for the top binding, I'm just going to use a straight stitch, back stitching at the beginning and the end of the seam, and using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, which is just the edge of your presser foot and the edge of your fabric. So I'm taking the end and kind of stretching that as I sew. So that's what it looks like. And I'm going to do that for both mittens while I have that stitch on my machine. I'm going to fold that in half, right sides together, line up my edges, and just sew this bottom wrist seam first, sewing from the bottom to the thumb hole, back stitching at the beginning and the end of the seam. Now I'm going to change the setting on my sewing machine to a zigzag stitch, and that will allow the mitten or the glove to stretch without popping the seam. If we were to sew that in a straight stitch, when you put the glove on and stretched it, the seam would pop and the seam would come undone, and we don't want that. So I have set the width of the zigzag stitch to a 3 and the length to a 2. Now before we sew this upper seam, we are going to hem the thumb hole. As you can see, this fabric is already even starting to fray a little bit. So I'm going to open that up and fold the edge of that thumb hole under just 1/4 inch, and then top stitch with that zigzag stitch. And so that's what it looks like. Now to sew that upper seam, bring the right sides together again, line up the edges, and you'll want to line up this binding seam. So make sure that that's lined up. Fold the seam allowance up towards the binding and pin it in place or clip it in place. When you get close, just take a moment to just adjust, readjust. Make sure things are lined up. Move your pin. And you can take your scissors and just trim off that excess just a little bit, making sure not to cut into the seam. Clipping off those threads. You don't have to clip off very much. Now to finish off that binding, I'm just going to fold it over and decide how much of that binding I want to show, if you want it thicker or thinner. Make sure that the seam allowance is folded up towards the binding and then fold it over. And I have a specific tutorial on using fleece as a binding that's really nice for blankets and all kinds of projects. I bind a lot of things with fleece. So fold that seam allowance up and fold that over. So you can kind of roll your fingers and feel if that is where it needs to be in place. And you have that top binding. So I'm going to go ahead and pin all the way around. And now we're going to take it to the sewing machine and stitch in the ditch. And by that I mean you're going to take it to the sewing machine and sew right in this little crevice of where you've already sewn. So don't worry about cutting or tucking this under. This is the beauty about this fleece, is it's not going to fray, and so it reduces a lot of the bulk by just doing it this way. So we're going to put the sewing machine stitch back onto a straight stitch. I've never had the seam pop in while using this binding technique. So I'm going to, and it's a lot cleaner finish. So set your machine back to a straight stitch. Lift up your presser foot, and you may have to lift up the presser foot a little bit more to get the bulk of this binding underneath. So adjust it. So when the needle comes down, it's going to be right in that ditch, the place where the binding and the sweater meet. So I'm going to turn my turn wheel of my hand wheel here towards me to bring my needle down to make sure I'm in the right place, and then start sewing. Back stitching, of course. And just take your time. When you get back to where you started, just back stitch. Cut your thread. Now to finish off that, as you can see, there's some excess bulk of fleece binding. So to clean that up, I'm just going to flatten my scissors, open them up, and stick one edge underneath and trim that off really close to the stitching. Being very careful not to cut the fabric. And you have a nice binding. Let's turn that inside out. Ta-da! You'll do that same thing on the other side, and you'll have yourself a cute pair of fingerless mittens ready to do whatever you need to do. Keep your hands warm while typing, sewing, outdoor activities, driving. I love my fingerless gloves. So on this pair of brown mittens, I would do the same thing. Apply my top binding, open it up, flip it over, and do my side seams. If I were needing to put binding on the top and the bottom, I would apply the top binding, sew it, open it up, and then do the same thing here and open it up, and then do my side seam, and then fold it over and stitch in the ditch. So many ways, so many color combinations, so many different kinds of sweaters. Be creative, have fun. Be sure to check out the tutorial on how to make these out of fleece. A little different. The pattern includes instructions for both. And watch for other upcoming fun winter sewing projects coming up. Make sure you're subscribing to the channel. We'll see you next time.